Overcoming mental rigidity. Have you ever noticed how people tend to default to the same ways of thinking, even when those ways clearly aren't working? I have seen that the biggest obstacle to creative problem solving isn't a lack of intelligence or skill, but the tendency to cling to familiar patterns, even when they no longer serve us. Could it be that real innovation isn't about learning more information, but about unlearning rigid thought patterns that keep us stuck? In my experience, the human brain is far more adaptable than we give it credit for, but only if we train it to be. Isn't it obvious that when we stop challenging ourselves, we stop growing? Have you noticed how the first solution people suggest is usually the most predictable one? What if, instead of settling for the first idea that comes to mind, we pushed ourselves to hold the problem a little longer, forcing our brains to reach for something beyond the obvious? Could it be that the best thinking doesn't happen automatically, but needs to be deliberately stretched into new directions? I have seen that the key to cognitive flexibility isn't about forcing people to think outside the box. It's about changing the shape of the box itself. Have you ever caught yourself dismissing an idea just because it doesn't make sense right away? What if the ideas that feel most uncomfortable at first are actually the ones with the most potential? Could it be that the real challenge isn't finding new ideas, but learning to sit with discomfort long enough to let new ideas take shape? And then there's the problem of certainty. Have you noticed how people become more rigid in their thinking when they feel uncertain or under pressure? I have seen that when people are afraid of making mistakes, they default to what feels safest and most familiar, even when that choice is clearly outdated. Could it be that the best way to unlock mental flexibility is not to demand better thinking, but to create an environment where people feel safe to challenge their own assumptions? What if it's not intelligence that makes people adaptable, but their willingness to question their own beliefs? I've also noticed that teams that value curiosity over certainty consistently outperform those that don't. Isn't it obvious that when people are more concerned with proving they're right than with learning something new, growth becomes impossible? What if real intelligence wasn't about having the right answers, but about being open to better ones? Could it be that the greatest breakthroughs don't come from defending old knowledge, but from being willing to explore the unknown? And what about the habit of quick conclusions? I have seen that people tend to rush to judgment because sitting in uncertainty feels uncomfortable. But isn't it obvious that the best solutions often require us to hold multiple conflicting ideas at once before clarity emerges? What if mental agility wasn't about speed, but about endurance, the ability to stay open to possibilities long enough for the best one to reveal itself? So the real question is, what if the key to smarter decision-making isn't about finding better answers, but about building a brain that's more comfortable with uncertainty? Could it be that the secret to real innovation, deep creativity, and effortless intelligence isn't about thinking harder, but about learning how to think in ways we haven't before? And if that's true, isn't it worth asking, how much more could we achieve if we stopped seeking comfort in what we already know and started training our minds to explore what we don't? Overcoming mental rigidity, unlocking cognitive flexibility through collaborative thinking. Some people get stuck in repetitive thinking loops because they only process information in familiar ways. Visionaries like ENTPs, INFJs, and INTJs naturally challenge assumptions, but practical thinkers like ISTJs, ESTJs, and ISFJs might resist concepts that don't have an immediate real-world application. If leadership only listens to the visionaries, execution suffers. If they only listen to the realists, innovation stalls. In a structured discussion, conceptual thinkers might introduce big-picture possibilities, asking, what if we approach this in an entirely new way? At first, the detail-focused types might resist, but by breaking down abstract ideas into clear, structured possibilities, they slowly become more open to different ways of thinking. This is how rigid, operational minds become willing to explore new directions, not by forcing them, but by helping them reframe what's possible in a way that makes sense to them. Rigid thinking often comes from not seeing the full picture. Some personalities, like INTPs, ISTPs, and ESTPs, are naturally adept at analyzing situations from multiple angles, while others, like ENFJs and ESFPs, focus on human interactions and social impact. If these perspectives aren't balanced, discussions can become either too abstract and disconnected from reality, or too emotionally driven without clear reasoning. A well-structured workshop ensures that all types engage in both logical and emotional cognition. A thinking type like an ENTJ or ISTJ might initially dismiss an emotionally driven argument, but if it's framed as, how does employee engagement impact productivity, their analytical brain is activated, making them more open to considering human factors. A feeling type like an INFP or ENFJ might resist a purely data-driven argument, but when shown a real-world case study that highlights the human experience behind the numbers, they become more willing to engage with logical analysis. Breaking mental rigidity isn't just about introducing new ideas. It's about making sure people actually process and absorb them. Some types, like ISTJs and ISFJs, need step-by-step clarity before they shift their perspective. Others, like ENTPs and INFPs, need room to explore contradictions and different viewpoints before settling on a conclusion. In a workshop setting, rigid thinkers might start by rejecting a new idea outright. But when given multiple ways to process the information through data, storytelling, role-playing, or hands-on problem-solving, they begin to shift from resistance to engagement. An INTJ who dismisses an idea as impractical might reconsider once an ISTJ presents a structured, step-by-step way to implement. An ENFP who struggles with structure might find it easier to adapt when an INFJ reframes the challenge in a way that aligns with their values and creativity. Even when people start to see new possibilities, they often default back to old habits unless the change is made practical and personal. This is where characterizing plays a role, turning new perspectives into structured, actionable solutions that people can commit to. A rigid ESTJ might resist a flexible work policy, insisting that structured office hours lead to higher productivity. But when shown evidence that flexibility improves employee retention and reduces turnover costs, their perspective starts to shift. An intuitive ENFP might love the idea of restructuring the workflow, but might struggle to articulate how it would work in a structured environment. A practical ISTP might step in and say, here's how we could test this with a small pilot program before rolling it out company-wide. By moving from abstract discussion to concrete solutions, the concept becomes reality, making it easier for even the most rigid thinkers to adapt. Overcoming mental rigidity isn't just about changing someone's mind in one meeting, it's about creating a habit of flexible thinking. The best way to do this is to ensure that all types of thinkers contribute to the final decision-making process. Judging types like ESTJs, ISTJs, INFJs, and INTJs ensure structure and accountability. Perceiving types like ENFPs, ENTPs, ISFPs, and INFPs push for adaptability and openness. Thinking types like ENTPs, INTJs, and ISTPs validate logic and practicality. Feeling types like ENFJs, ISFPs, and INFPs ensure alignment with human needs and values. A collaborative leadership model ensures that rigid thinking doesn't creep back in by making ongoing reflection and adaptability a part of the decision-making process. Instead of assuming that one approach is correct, decisions are tested, evaluated, and refined over time, making cognitive flexibility a built-in feature rather than an afterthought. So, what happens when you break mental rigidity in this way? People start to think beyond their defaults, integrating logic with empathy, structure with flexibility, and execution with adaptability. And in a world that is constantly changing, isn't it obvious that the most valuable skill isn't just being knowledgeable? It's being able to rethink, reframe, and grow in response to new challenges.